Imagine a serene lake, a picture-perfect postcard scene. In the middle of this lake sits a small island, and on that island, a volcano. This is Taal, a beautiful but deceptive landmark in the Philippines. Today, we know it as one of the most active volcanoes in the world, but over a century ago, people saw it differently. They lived right at its feet on the island itself, farming the rich volcanic soil, their lives intertwined with the moods of the mountain. But in January 1911, the postcard-perfect scene was about to be torn apart in one of the most devastating eruptions of the 20th century. This is the story of the 1911 Taal Volcano eruption, a forgotten catastrophe. The year is 1911. The Philippines is under American colonial rule. On Volcano Island, life moves at a gentle pace. Several small villages or barrios dot the island's shores. The people here are accustomed to the volcano's rumblings. Small earthquakes and puffs of steam were just part of the background noise of daily life. For years, Taal had been relatively quiet, lulling everyone into a false sense of security. They had no idea they were living on a ticking time bomb. The first real sign of trouble came on January 27th. The ground began to shake more frequently and more violently. The rumbles from the main crater grew louder, like a sleeping giant stirring. Observers from the Manila Observatory, including the dedicated Jesuit priest Father Miguel Caldera Mazo, noted the increasing activity. They knew something was coming, but the technology and understanding of volcanology were limited. Evacuation warnings were issued, but they were difficult to enforce and, for many residents, hard to take seriously. Leave their homes, their farms, their entire lives, because the mountain was making a little more noise than usual. For many, it was an unthinkable choice. Then, in the dead of night, in the early hours of January 28th, the giant awoke. A massive, deafening explosion ripped through the darkness. The main crater of Taal erupted in what's known as a pelon-type eruption, the most dangerous kind. It didn't just spew lava upwards, it exploded sideways. A pyroclastic flow, a superheated, fast-moving cloud of ash, gas, and rock fragments blasted out from the crater. It was an incandescent, deadly hurricane, moving at incredible speeds across the island. This cloud of death was heavier than air, so it hugged the ground, incinerating everything in its path in a matter of seconds. Trees, houses, animals, and people. Nothing could withstand its hellish temperature and force. The entire Volcano Island was engulfed. The villages that had existed just moments before were wiped from the face of the earth. The beautiful, serene lake became a scene of horror. The blast was so powerful it created a tsunami-like wave or seiche in the lake. The water surged outwards, crashing into the shores of the mainland towns surrounding the lake, like Talisay and Lemery, causing even more destruction and death. The sound of the explosion was heard hundreds of kilometers away. In Manila, about 60 kilometers north, people were woken by the thunderous boom and saw a terrifying, mushroom-shaped cloud rising in the southern sky. The sky turned dark as a thick blanket of ash began to fall, coating everything in a layer of gray grit. It was a terrifying spectacle, and the capital knew that a major disaster had just occurred. As dawn broke, the true scale of the catastrophe began to emerge. Rescue and relief efforts were immediately launched. The American authorities, along with the Philippine Constabulary, mobilized boats to reach the devastated areas. One of the first on the scene was a photographer named Charles Martin. He was working for the Bureau of Science, and his photographs would become the primary visual record of this horrific event. His images are haunting. They show a landscape utterly transformed, a gray, barren wasteland where vibrant villages once stood. Trees were stripped bare, their trunks scorched and splintered. The ground was covered in a thick layer of mud and ash, almost like a dark volcanic snow. But the most harrowing sights were the human cost. The rescuers found a scene of utter devastation. The official death toll was recorded at 1,335, but many historians believe the actual number was much higher, perhaps closer to 1,500 or even more. Entire families were wiped out. The pyroclastic flow had killed instantly, leaving victims buried in ash or horribly burned. The descriptions from the time are graphic and heartbreaking. Rescuers spoke of a zone of death where no living thing survived. The few who were on the fringes of the blast and survived their initial injuries often died later from severe burns or from inhaling the hot ash and gas. The relief efforts were immense. The American Red Cross and colonial government set up refugee camps and hospitals on the mainland. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to treat the injured, battling horrific burns and respiratory problems. The story of Dean Worcester, the American Secretary of the Interior for the Philippines at the time, is particularly notable. He personally led some of the initial rescue missions. He was a controversial figure in Philippine history, but his hands-on involvement in the Taal relief effort is a matter of record. He documented what he saw in detailed reports, describing the almost unimaginable destruction and the suffering of the people. In the aftermath, the government made a crucial decision. Volcano Island was declared uninhabitable. It was deemed too dangerous for permanent settlement. This was a logical, life-saving policy. But history has a way of repeating itself. Over the decades, as the memory of the 1911 horror faded, people began to return. The fertile soil was too tempting, the pull of their ancestral home too strong. The barrios were slowly rebuilt, and a new generation grew up on the slopes of the volcano, once again living in the shadow of the giant. The 1911 eruption left a lasting scar, not just on the landscape, but on the collective memory of the region. It served as a brutal reminder of Taal's power. The volcano would erupt again, notably in 1965, with another violent pyroclastic eruption that claimed hundreds more lives, once again devastating the communities that had returned to the island. And of course, many of us remember the most recent eruption in January 2020, which sent a colossal ash plume miles into the atmosphere, forcing mass evacuations and reminding the world once again that this beautiful volcano is a sleeping, and sometimes waking danger. The story of the 1911 Taal eruption is more than just a historical account of a natural disaster. It's a story about the complex relationship between humans and nature. It's a tale of resilience of people who, despite facing unimaginable loss, found ways to carry on. It is also a cautionary tale about the importance of respecting the power of our planet and the need for scientific understanding and preparedness. The photographs of Charles Martin and the reports of people like Father Mazo and Dean Worcester ensure that the 1,335 souls who perished on that terrible night are not forgotten. Their story is a vital part of the history of Taal, a permanent warning etched into the very ash that once covered their homes. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into fascinating historical events. Let me know in the comments what other historical stories you'd like to see covered. Stay curious and see you in the next video. Before we continue this story, subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us tell the true stories of Earth's most powerful volcanoes. Imagine a volcano erupting with such force that the ground itself caves in, collapsing into the now empty magma chamber far below. What's left isn't a mountain, but a giant bowl carved into the Earth's surface. This is a caldera. Over thousands of years, rain fills this massive depression and it becomes a lake. But deep beneath the water, the volcano is not dead. It's just sleeping. This is the story of the Taal caldera in the Philippines, a colossal 9-mile-wide scar on the planet. Its creation tens of thousands of years ago must have been an apocalyptic event. An eruption so powerful it launched cubic miles of rock and ash into the atmosphere, darkening the skies over entire continents. When the dust finally settled, a mountain had been replaced by a crater. And into this crater, the rains came year after year, century after century, until it became Lake Taal. But the magma chamber that created this chaos never truly went away. Beneath the lake floor, molten rock continued to gather and pressure continued to build. Eventually, the volcano found a new way out, a new throat to the surface. This new path emerged as Volcano Island, a cone of hardened lava rising right from the center of the lake. It stands there like a warning finger, pointing to the sky, a constant reminder of the power lurking below. For the people who eventually settled around Taal's shores, this unique geography created a deadly illusion. They saw a peaceful lake, a fertile island, and a mountain that looked stable, dormant, and safe. They couldn't see the vast reservoir of molten rock simmering just 2 miles beneath their feet. They didn't understand that the lake itself was the remnant of an ancient, world-altering catastrophe. They didn't know that Volcano Island wasn't the real volcano. It was just the most recent exit wound of a system far larger and far more dangerous than anything visible above the water. By the time Spanish colonizers arrived in the Philippines in the 16th century, indigenous people had been living around Taal for thousands of years. They had seen eruptions, they had passed down stories. But human memory is tragically short compared to geological time. The truly landscape-altering eruptions happen so rarely that they fade from living memory within just a few generations. The Spanish, however, kept better records. And what those records show is chilling. Between 1572 and 1911, Taal erupted at least 33 times. Some of these were minor events, a few tremors, a small cloud of ash, just a little reminder of the restlessness below. But others were absolutely devastating. In 1754, an eruption began that would last for 7 months. Ash buried entire towns. The volcanic clouds were so thick with superheated particles that they collided with incredible violence, creating massive lightning storms that tore through the sky. Thousands of people died. And yet within years, people returned. They rebuilt their homes. They planted new crops in the ash-enriched soil. They fished in the lake, which was now deeper and wider from the eruption's sheer force. This is the paradox of living near volcanoes. They are among the most dangerous places on Earth, yet they are also some of the most fertile. Volcanic ash is packed with minerals like phosphorus, potassium, and calcium. It creates incredibly rich soil that can feed generations. For farmers living on the edge of survival, that promise of abundance is irresistible, even if it means living in the shadow of death. By 1911, the memory of the great 1754 eruption had faded. Most people living on Volcano Island itself had never experienced a major eruption in their lifetime. To them, Taal was a provider, not a threat. The lake gave them fish, the soil gave them rice, the island was their home. And the mountain... well, the mountain was just a mountain. Silent. Still. It seemed to be sleeping. But beneath that silence, something was changing. Magma was rising, pressure was building. The mountain was about to wake up. The first signs appeared in early January of 1911. Small earthquakes began to ripple through the region. They were barely noticeable to most, but unmistakable to those who knew what to look for. The ground would tremble during meals. Water in wells would slosh back and forth. At night, people would wake up feeling their homes swaying gently, as if rocked by invisible hands. Now, earthquakes are as common as rain in the Philippines, but these were happening more and more frequently. Then the lake itself started to change. Fishermen noticed that parts of the water had become warmer. Not just pleasantly warm, but unnaturally hot. In some spots near Volcano Island, dead fish floated to the surface, literally cooked alive by the water being heated from the magma below. The distinct smell of sulfur began to drift across the lake. It was faint at first, but by the middle of January it was so strong that people in the lakeside town of Talisay could smell it from their homes. On Volcano Island, the residents saw even more direct signs. The small crater lake at the volcano's summit began to churn and bubble. Steam rose from vents that had been dormant for years. The ground in some areas became too hot to walk on with bare feet. And at night, some people reported seeing a faint, eerie glow coming from the crater, the reflection of molten rock rising closer and closer to the surface. These were not subtle warnings. They were alarm bells, screaming that something was terribly wrong. And yet, most people on the island chose to stay. Why? The answer is complicated. It's a mix of poverty, faith, and the simple human tendency to believe that disasters happen to other people, not to us. Many families on Volcano Island had lived there for generations. Their homes were there. Their boats were there. Their entire livelihoods depended on the lake's fish and the island's fertile soil. Leaving meant abandoning everything they owned, with no guarantee of finding work or a place to live on the mainland. For people living in poverty, evacuation isn't a simple choice. It's an economic catastrophe in itself. There was also a deeper, more spiritual reason. The Philippines had been under Spanish colonial rule for over 3 centuries, and Catholicism had merged with indigenous beliefs. This created a worldview where natural disasters were often seen as expressions of divine will. If God wanted to protect them, he would. If he didn't, then no amount of running could save them. This fatalism wasn't born from ignorance. It was a way of finding peace in a world that felt completely unpredictable. And so, as the ground shook and the air filled with the smell of sulfur, the people of Volcano Island prayed, they watched, and they waited. They trusted in their homes, their history, and their faith, unaware that they were living on the edge of one of the deadliest volcanic eruptions of the 20th century. The mountain was no longer sleeping. It was awake. And it was angry. Thank you for watching. If you found this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the powerful forces that shape our world. See you next time. But there were those who chose to leave. In the final days before the eruption, some families packed what they could carry and made the crossing to the mainland. They were mocked by those who stayed, called cowards, called foolish for abandoning good land over a few tremors and bad smells. After all, Taal had been smoking and rumbling for weeks, and nothing had happened. Perhaps nothing would. This is the cruel mathematics of volcanic prediction. Volcanoes can show warning signs for weeks, months, even years before a major eruption. But they can also show the exact same signs, and then go quiet. Without modern instruments, seismographs, gas sensors, satellite monitoring, there was no way to know whether Taal was building toward catastrophe or simply venting pressure harmlessly into the sky. The people of Volcano Island had to make their decisions based on instinct, experience, and faith. Most chose to stay. By the morning of January 30th, the situation had reached a critical point. The earthquakes had grown stronger and more frequent. The sulfur smell was overwhelming. The crater lake was boiling violently, sending clouds of steam hundreds of feet into the air. And still, most of the island's 13 villages went about their daily routines. Fishermen prepared their nets. Children attended school. Women washed clothing in the lake's warm shallows. At noon, a particularly strong earthquake shook the island. This one was different. It didn't stop. The ground continued to tremble, not in discrete jolts, but in a continuous vibration that made walking difficult. Scientists call this harmonic tremor. It happens when magma moves rapidly through underground channels, causing the rock around it to vibrate like the skin of a drum. Harmonic tremor is often the final warning before an explosive eruption. On Volcano Island, it lasted for nearly 3 hours. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the tremor stopped. For a brief moment, everything went still. The ground ceased shaking. The birds stopped singing. The wind fell silent. It was the kind of silence that makes the hair on your arms stand up. The kind of silence that feels like the earth itself is holding its breath. And then, with a sound like the tearing of the sky, Taal exploded. What happened next would be recorded by survivors, by scientists, and by seismographs as far away as Japan. The eruption column shot nearly 4 miles into the stratosphere in a matter of minutes. But the deadliest part of the eruption wasn't the ash cloud. It was what came down the mountain. Fast, hot, unstoppable. The warnings had been clear. The earth had spoken. But for the 1,335 people who remained on Volcano Island, those warnings had come in a language they couldn't fully understand. And by the time the silence broke, it was already too late. The explosion was heard over 100 miles away. In Manila, windows shattered. Church bells rang spontaneously from the shockwave. People who had never seen Taal, who didn't even know where it was, looked south toward a sky that had suddenly turned black. But on Volcano Island itself, there was no time to look at the sky. There was only fire and ash and the terrible realization that there was nowhere to run. The eruption began with what volcanologists call a phreatomagmatic explosion. When rising magma encounters water, whether from an underground aquifer, a crater lake, or in Taal's case, both, the water flashes instantly to steam. Steam occupies roughly 1,600 times the volume of liquid water. That expansion happens in microseconds. The result is an explosion of almost unimaginable violence. The force ripped open the volcano's throat. Rock that had sealed the vent for years was pulverized into fine ash. Gas that had been trapped under immense pressure, sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, water vapor erupted outward with the force of thousands of tons of dynamite. And beneath it all, magma surged upward, fragmenting into billions of molten particles as it decompressed. The eruption column climbed at over 300 miles per hour. Within minutes, it had punched through the troposphere and entered the stratosphere. From the mainland, witnesses described a sight both beautiful and terrifying. The column was black at its base, where ash and rock fragments dominated. But higher up, it glowed orange and red, illuminated from within by superheated gases and incandescent particles. Lightning arced through the cloud. Not ordinary lightning. Volcanic lightning, created when ash particles collide with such violence that they generate massive static charges. The bolts were continuous, branching through the column like the veins of some vast malevolent creature. Thunder rolled across the lake in waves that never seemed to end. But the people on Volcano Island saw none of this. They were already dead. The eruption column is spectacular, but it is not the primary killer in an explosive eruption. The true danger comes from what volcanologists call pyroclastic density currents. These are flows of superheated gas ash, and rock fragments that race down the slopes of a volcano at speeds that can exceed 100 miles per hour. Their temperature can reach 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Nothing organic survives contact with them. At Taal, these flows emerged from the base of the eruption column almost immediately. They didn't flow like lava, slow, predictable, escapable. They moved like avalanches, like hurricanes made of fire. The geography of Volcano Island made them even deadlier. The island is small, only 3 miles across at its widest point. There was no high ground to flee to. No shelters that could withstand the flows. The villages were built on the lower slopes and coastal areas, precisely where the pyroclastic currents would be channeled by the island topography. It was a perfect trap. The flows reached the village of Kalawit first. Witnesses on the mainland, watching through telescopes and binoculars, described what they saw. One moment, the village was visible through the smoke and ash. The next, it was engulfed by a gray-black cloud that moved with horrifying speed. When the cloud passed, the village was gone. Not burned. Not collapsed. Simply gone. Erased. The same fate overtook Bugan, Subic-Alaya, and the 10 other villages scattered across the island. In some places, the flows were so hot they melted metal. Fishing boats caught in the shallows were reduced to charcoal. Stone foundations cracked and crumbled under the thermal shock. Bamboo homes ignited before the flows even reached them, set alight by the radiant heat. For the people caught in these flows, death was instantaneous. The temperatures are so extreme that the human body doesn't have time to register pain. The lungs are seared in the first breath. The brain ceases function within seconds. It is, by some measures, a merciful end. But mercy is cold comfort to those who survived on the mainland, watching the island they knew transformed into a gray wasteland. The entire eruption, from the initial explosion to the final pyroclastic flow, lasted 13 minutes. 13 minutes to erase 13 villages. 30 minutes to claim 1,335 lives. 30 minutes to demonstrate the terrible power hidden beneath the Earth's serene surface. When the flows finally stopped, Volcano Island was buried under several feet of ash and pumice. The landscape had been completely transformed. Where there had been green hills and clustered homes, there was now only a uniform gray desert. No trees, no buildings, no movement. The silence that followed the eruption was profound. It was the silence of absence. The silence of a place where life had existed moments before, and now existed no more. On the mainland, survivors stood at the lake's edge, staring across the water. Some wept, some prayed. Some simply stood in shock, unable to process what they had witnessed. Many had family on the island, brothers, sisters, parents, children, all gone. As darkness fell that evening, the volcano continued to rumble. Smaller eruptions sent fresh pulses of ash into the sky. The lake water, contaminated by volcanic debris, lapped against the shores in thick, gray waves. And across the region, ash began to fall like snow. It fell on Manila. It fell on towns 100 miles away. It fell on ships at sea. For days afterward, the sun would rise through a haze of volcanic particles, turning the sky strange shades of orange and red. 30 minutes. That's all it took. 30 minutes for a mountain to remind humanity of its true place in the natural order. Not as masters of the earth, but as guests. Temporary, fragile, and entirely at the mercy of forces we barely understand. The bodies were never recovered. They remain on the island still, buried beneath layers of volcanic rock. Silent witnesses to the speed with which the world can end. When dawn broke on January 31st, 1911, the world had changed. Not just for the families who had lost loved ones. Not just for the communities around Taal Lake, but for everyone who understood what had happened. The mountain had spoken, and its message was written in ash and silence. The first boats ventured toward Volcano Island at sunrise. They moved slowly, cautiously, through water turned gray and thick with suspended ash. Dead fish floated everywhere, thousands of them, covering the surface like a grotesque carpet. The water itself was warm, unnaturally warm. In some places, it was still steaming. As the boats approached the island, the full scope of the devastation became clear. The shoreline was unrecognizable. Where there had been beaches, there were now steep banks of ash and pumice. Where there had been docks and fishing platforms, there was nothing. The entire coastal geography had been rewritten in those 30 minutes. The rescue parties that landed on the island found a landscape from another world. Everything was gray. The ground. The air. The light filtering through the ash-choked sky. They called out names, hoping against hope for survivors. Their voices echoed across the empty slopes. No one answered. In some places they found remnants of the villages, a fragment of a wall, a cooking pot, half buried, a wooden cross from a chapel, charred but still standing. But mostly they found nothing. The pyroclastic flows had been so hot, so violent, that they had pulverized most structures down to their foundations, and the ash had buried what remained. The bodies, when they were found, told the story of those final moments. Some victims had been caught in the open trying to run. Others had died inside their homes, huddled together. A few had made it to the shore, perhaps hoping to swim to safety. But the flows had moved too fast. No one had escaped. The recovery effort continued for days, but it was largely symbolic. The ash was too deep, too unstable. Equipment kept breaking down in the abrasive volcanic dust. And there was the constant threat that the volcano might erupt again. Eventually, the decision was made to leave the dead where they lay. Volcano Island would become their tomb. On the mainland, the survivors faced their own devastation. Entire families had been wiped out. Children had lost parents. Parents had lost children. The social fabric of the lakeside communities was torn apart. And beyond the human toll, there was the economic destruction. The fishing industry, the lifeblood of the region, had collapsed. The lake was poisoned with volcanic chemicals. Fish continued to die for weeks after the eruption. The boats that hadn't been destroyed were rendered useless. There was nothing to catch. Agricultural land for miles around was buried under ash. In some places, the ash layer was several inches deep. It would take years for the soil to recover. Crops that hadn't been harvested were lost. Seeds stored for the next planting season were contaminated. Families that had been subsistence farmers now faced starvation. The colonial government, such as it was, provided some relief. Food was distributed. Temporary shelters were erected. But the response was inadequate for the scale of the disaster. This was 1911. There was no international aid network. No disaster relief organizations with helicopters and supply chains. The survivors were largely left to rebuild on their own. And rebuild they did, because what else could they do? This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about volcanic disasters. The survivors always return, always. Within months, people were fishing the lake again. Within a year, they were planting crops in the ash-enriched soil. Within a decade, new communities had formed on the very shores where thousands had died. Some might call this foolishness, but it's more complicated than that. For the poor, for the landless, for those with no other options, volcanic regions offer something precious: fertility. The same ash that killed thousands would, in time, create some of the richest soil in the Philippines. The lake would recover. The fish would return. And life, as it always does, would find a way to continue. But the memory of 1911 lingered, in the stories passed down through generations. In the empty spaces where villages once stood. In the way people would pause in their work on hot afternoons and look toward the island with a mixture of gratitude and fear. The scientific community took notice. The 1911 eruption became one of the most studied volcanic events of the early 20th century. Geologists traveled from around the world to examine the island. They measured the ash deposits. They mapped the extent of the pyroclastic flows. They interviewed survivors, trying to piece together a timeline of the eruption. Their goal was to understand. To learn, to find ways of predicting when the next eruption might come. What they discovered was both enlightening and deeply troubling. Taal was not a typical volcano. Its position within a lake created unique dangers. The interaction between magma and water made its eruptions particularly explosive and unpredictable. And its history suggested that the 1911 event, as devastating as it was, might not be the worst Taal was capable of. The geological record showed evidence of much larger eruptions in the distant past. Eruptions that had reshaped the entire caldera. Eruptions that, if they occurred today, could threaten not just the lakeside communities, but Manila itself. This knowledge created a dilemma. Should people be forbidden from living near Taal? Should the government forcibly relocate communities? But to where? And with what resources? The Philippines is a crowded country. Land is precious. And the people around Taal had lived there for generations. It was their home. So a compromise was reached. People would be allowed to stay, but monitoring would increase. Seismographs would be installed. Gas emissions would be measured. And if the volcano showed signs of awakening, evacuations would be ordered. It was an imperfect solution, but it was the best that could be done. In the years that followed, Taal rumbled periodically. Small eruptions in 1965, 1968, and 1970 caused minor damage but few casualties. The monitoring systems worked. People evacuated. Lives were saved. And slowly, the terror of 1911 began to fade. Not entirely, never entirely, but enough that life could continue. Enough that children could play by the lake without constant fear. Enough that fishermen could cast their nets at dawn, hoping for a good catch. Today, over a century after the eruption, Taal remains one of the most closely watched volcanoes on Earth, but it also remains one of the most inhabited. Over 500,000 people live within the danger zone. They live there knowing the risks. They live there because they have no choice. They live there because the alternative, abandoning their homes, their livelihoods, their history, is unthinkable. And Taal? Taal sleeps, for now. To understand a volcano is to understand a conversation between fire and stone that has been ongoing for billions of years. It is a conversation written in the language of pressure and heat, of melting and crystallization, of forces so vast that they move continents and raise mountains from the seafloor. Taal is one voice in this ancient dialogue. And if we listen carefully, we can learn to interpret what it is trying to tell us. Beneath Taal, approximately 2 miles down, lies a chamber of molten rock. This is not a cavern filled with liquid, as we might imagine. It is more like a sponge, a network of spaces within partially molten rock, where magma exists in pockets and channels, constantly moving, constantly changing. The magma itself is not uniform. It varies in composition, in temperature, and the amount of dissolved gases it contains. And these variations determine how the volcano will behave when it erupts. Taal's magma is what geologists call andesitic to basaltic in composition. This means it contains significant amounts of silica, the compound that makes up sand and glass. Silica gives magma viscosity. It makes it thick, sticky, resistant to flow. And that stickiness has profound implications. When magma is fluid, low in silica, gases can escape easily. The eruptions tend to be gentle, producing lava flows that move slowly enough that people can walk away from them. Hawaii's volcanoes work this way. Spectacular, yes, but rarely deadly. But when magma is viscous, high in silica, gases become trapped. They cannot escape gradually. Pressure builds and builds. Until something gives, imagine shaking a bottle of champagne. The carbon dioxide dissolved in the liquid wants to escape, to form bubbles, but the cork prevents it. Pressure increases. When you finally remove the cork, the release is explosive. Foam erupts violently from the bottle. This is essentially what happens in a volcanic eruption. But instead of champagne, it's molten rock at 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And instead of a bottle, it's the entire weight of a mountain holding down the pressure. At Taal, there is an additional factor that makes eruptions particularly dangerous: water. In the heart of the Philippines lies a lake, and within that lake, an island. But this is no ordinary island. It's a volcano, Taal, and its story is one of unimaginable power, scientific endeavor, and the enduring spirit of the people who live in its shadow. Taal is unique, and uniquely dangerous. Its magma chamber sits deep beneath water-saturated rock. When molten rock rises and meets this water, the result is catastrophic. The water flashes to steam in an instant. But, unlike steam from a kettle, this steam is trapped, confined by layers of rock and the immense weight of the lake above. The pressure builds, turning the earth into a colossal pressure cooker. It's like a bomb deep underground with a lit fuse. When the rock finally gives way, the explosion is violent enough to pulverize stone into fine ash and hurl it miles into the sky. This is exactly what happened in 1911, a cataclysm that claimed over 1,000 lives and etched itself into the memory of this land. This explosive potential is what makes Taal so deadly. Today, science gives us a fighting chance. Modern volcanology has armed us with an array of tools to listen to the mountain's whispers. Seismographs detect the faint tremors of magma moving underground. Gas sensors sniff the air for telltale increases in sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide, gases that escape as magma nears the surface. GPS stations track the subtle, almost imperceptible swelling of the ground as the magma chamber inflates below. High above, satellites monitor temperature changes and ground deformation from space. Here at Taal, all these systems are in place. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, or PHIVOLCS, maintains a constant, vigilant watch. Teams of dedicated scientists monitor data 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They search for patterns, for anomalies, for the same signs that preceded the Great Eruption of 1911. But here's the challenge. Volcanoes are not clocks. They don't run on our schedules. A volcano can show warning signs for months and then erupt. It can show the very same signs and then quiet down, doing nothing at all. Or, most terrifyingly, it can erupt with almost no warning. In January 2020, Taal spoke again. While not as violent as the 1911 event, it was a major eruption. An ash column rocketed 9 miles high, a dark plume against the tropical sky. Ash fell like snow across the capital, Manila, grinding the bustling metropolis to a halt. Flights were canceled. Life was put on hold. Hundreds of thousands of people were evacuated from the danger zone. The warning signs had been there. Increased seismic activity, rising gas emissions, ground deformation. PHIVOLCS saw the pattern, raised the alert level, and urged evacuations. And because of this, because of the monitoring, the science, and the rapid response, the human cost was minimal. A few tragic deaths occurred during the scramble to evacuate, but nothing remotely close to the devastation of 1911. The science had worked. It had saved lives. Yet, for all our technology, for all our growing understanding, we cannot stop a volcanic eruption. We can only watch and warn and hope that when the mountain speaks, people will listen. There's something deeply humbling in this limitation. We live in an age where we have split the atom and sent probes to the very edge of our solar system. We can edit the building blocks of life and create machines that think, but we cannot stop a volcano. We are powerless to prevent the Earth from releasing the immense pressure building in its depths. All we can do is step aside. This isn't a failure of science. It's a profound reminder of scale. The energy released by a major volcanic eruption is measured in megatons, equivalent to the force of many nuclear weapons. No human technology can contain that kind of power. The best we can do is understand it, respect it, and give it the space it demands, and at Taal, the process continues. 2 miles down, the magma chamber is still active. Molten rock continues to accumulate. Gases continue to dissolve into the melt. Pressure continues its slow, inexorable build. The next major eruption could happen tomorrow, or it might not happen for another 100 years. The mountain operates on its own timeline, a geological clock measured not in human lifespans but in epochs. What we know for certain is this: Taal will erupt again. It's not a question of if, but when. So, the real question we face isn't whether we can prevent it, it's whether we can live alongside it responsibly. Can we build communities that are prepared? Can we create systems that protect lives when the inevitable occurs? Can we, across generations, remember what this mountain is capable of? Because the Earth does not forget. It keeps a perfect record in layers of ash and lava, in the shape of the land, in the very chemistry of the rocks. The Earth remembers every eruption, every pyroclastic flow, every moment of raw power. And it asks us, in its patient, implacable way, a simple question: will you remember too? The science of volcanology is ultimately the science of listening. Listening to the tremors in the ground. Listening to the gases venting from the crater. Listening to the ancient lessons written in stone. Here at Taal, the listening continues. The instruments record. The scientists analyze. The mountain, for now, remains quiet. But beneath that quiet, the timeless conversation between fire and earth goes on. Patient, relentless, eternal. If this story of science and survival resonates with you, you read part of a community that believes knowledge is how we honor both the power of nature and the lives it has touched. Stay with us. The story of Taal is far from over. On the shores of Taal Lake sits the village of San Nicolas. From the main road, you can see Volcano Island rising from the water, a gray-green cone against the sky. Perpetually wreathed in mist, children play in the streets. Fishermen mend their nets in the afternoon shade. Laundry flutters in the lake breeze. It looks like any other peaceful rural Philippine town. But everyone who lives here knows the truth. They are living on borrowed time. To truly understand Taal, we must understand the people who refuse to leave. Not because they are ignorant of the danger, but because they have made a calculated choice. It's a choice that weighs risk against livelihood, fear against hope, memory against the pressing needs of today. Meet Rosa Mendoza. She is 73 years old. She has lived her entire life within sight of the volcano. Her grandmother was lost in the 1911 eruption. She herself evacuated in 1965 and again in 1968 and once more in 2020. And each time she returned. Her story, and the stories of her neighbors, are the human heart of this geological drama. Their resilience is as much a part of this landscape as the volcano itself. Thanks for watching. If you want to continue exploring the complex relationship between humanity and the powerful forces of our planet, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Where else would I go? She asks, sitting on the porch of her small wooden home. This is where my family is buried. This is where I raise my children. This lake has fed us for generations. She gestures toward the water where her son is pulling in the morning's catch. The volcano will do what it will do. But until that day comes, we have to eat. It is a simple logic. And an unassailable one. The economics of volcanic risk are rarely discussed in disaster documentaries. We see the eruptions. We count the casualties. We marvel at the power of nature. But we rarely ask, why do people stay? The answer almost always is poverty. The land around Taal Lake is some of the most fertile in the Philippines. The volcanic soil is rich in nutrients. Rice grows abundantly here, vegetables thrive, fruit trees produce heavy yields. For farmers with small plots of land, this fertility means the difference between subsistence and starvation. Leaving would mean abandoning not just a home, but a livelihood. And going where? To Manila, where housing is expensive and jobs are scarce. To other provinces where they have no connections, no family, no support network. The fishing industry tells the same story. Taal Lake is home to the tawelis, a species of sardine found nowhere else on Earth. These small, silvery fish are a delicacy. They provide income for thousands of families. The fishermen know the lake is dangerous. They know that volcanic gases sometimes kill fish overnight. They know that another eruption could poison the water for years. But they also know that today, right now, the lake is alive with fish, and their children need to eat today. This is the cruel arithmetic of disaster zones. The future threat is abstract. The present need is concrete. There's also a cultural dimension that outsiders often miss. In the Philippines, as in many places with active volcanoes, the relationship with these mountains is not purely adversarial. There is reverence, even affection. Taal is not just a geological feature. It is part of the identity of the region. It appears in local legends, in songs, in the stories grandparents tell. It is simultaneously feared and loved. A dangerous relative who occasionally destroys everything, but who also provides, who has shaped the land and the culture in fundamental ways. To leave Taal would be to sever a connection that goes back centuries, and there is faith. Deep, unshakable faith. In San Nicolas, there is a small chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Inside, a statue of the Virgin faces toward Volcano Island. Candles burn day and night. People come here to pray for protection, for calm seas, for good catches, for the mountain to stay quiet. Father Antonio, the local priest, is pragmatic about this faith. I tell them to evacuate when the warnings come, he says. I tell them science is a gift from God and we must listen to the scientists. But I also understand. These people have nowhere else to go, so they pray. And I pray with them. He pauses, looking toward the island. And sometimes prayer is all we have. The children of San Nicolas grow up with a unique perspective. They learn to read the mountain the way other children learn to read the weather. They know what harmonic tremors sound like. They recognize the smell of sulfur. They understand that when the birds suddenly leave the island, something is wrong. In school, they practice evacuation drills. Not once a year like fire drills in other countries. Several times a semester, they know the routes. They know where the emergency supplies are stored. They know which buildings are designated shelters. By the time they are 10 years old, they are experts in disaster preparedness. It is a strange childhood. But it is the only one they know. Maria Santos is 17. She dreams of becoming a nurse, of moving to Manila for university, of leaving Taal behind. But she also knows that if her family needs her, if the fishing is poor, if her father gets sick, if money is tight, she will stay. She will marry someone from the village. She will raise her children within sight of the volcano. And the cycle will continue. I'm not afraid of it, she says, looking at Volcano Island. Or maybe I am, but you get used to being afraid. It becomes normal. She thinks for a moment. My great-grandmother survived 1911. My grandmother survived 1965. My mother survived 2020. Maybe I'll survive whatever comes next. Or maybe I won't. But either way, this is home. There are approximately 450,000 people living within the permanent danger zone around Taal. They are shopkeepers and farmers, teachers and fishermen, children and elders. They are not there because they are reckless. They are there because life has placed them there, and extracting themselves is far more complicated than simply deciding to leave. The government has proposed resettlement programs. They have drawn maps showing safe zones and danger zones. They have built evacuation centers and stockpiled supplies. But they cannot force people to abandon their homes permanently, not in a democracy. Not without providing viable alternatives. And viable alternatives require resources that don't exist. So the people stay, and the scientists monitor. And when the mountain stirs, the dance begins again. The 2020 eruption was a test of this system. When Phoebelks raised the alert level, thousands evacuated immediately. They went to shelters. They stayed with relatives. They waited. For weeks they lived in uncertainty. Schools were closed, businesses were shuttered. Daily life was suspended. And then, gradually the activity decreased. The alert level was lowered. People returned home, back to the lake, back to the shadow of the mountain. Because where else would they go? This is the reality of living with volcanoes. It is not dramatic. It is not a single moment of heroism or tragedy. It is the daily choice to continue living, to continue working, to continue hoping that today will not be the day the mountain wakes. Rosa Mendoza, sitting on her porch, says it best. The volcano will outlive us all. It was here before we arrived. It will be here after we're gone. But while we're here, we live. We laugh, we raise our families. We fish the lake and plant our crops and go to church on Sundays. What else can we do? She smiles. The mountain will have its day. But today is ours. There is wisdom in this. A recognition that life anywhere is uncertain. That safety is an illusion. That the question is not whether we face risk, but how we choose to live in the face of it. The people of Taal have chosen to live fully. In the shadow of fire, in the embrace of danger. In the only home they know. Stand on the shore of Taal Lake at dawn, when the mist rises from the water and the world is quiet, and you are standing in a museum. Not a museum of human making with glass cases and placards, but a museum built by the earth itself. Every stone, every layer of ash, every curve of the shoreline. Each is a page in a book written over hundreds of thousands of years. And if we learn to read this book, it tells us something profound about the nature of time and change and the forces that shape our world. Geologists who study Taal are not just studying a single volcano. They are studying a system that has been active for at least 450,000 years. Perhaps longer. The caldera we see today, the bowl that holds Taal Lake, is the result of at least 2 massive eruptions in the distant past. Eruptions so powerful that they are difficult to comprehend. These were not events like 1911, which killed thousands and devastated an island. These were events that reshaped the landscape itself. That ejected cubic miles of rock into the atmosphere. That created ash clouds that circled the globe, cooling the climate for years. That left scars in the Earth's crust that remain visible 500,000 years later. Scientists call these VEI-6 eruptions. The Volcanic Explosivity Index is a scale from 0 to 8, measuring the size and intensity of volcanic eruptions. Each number represents an increase of 10 times the previous level. The 1911 eruption was approximately a VEI-4, devastating yes, but small compared to what Taal has done before. A VEI-6 eruption produces at least 10 cubic kilometers of volcanic material. To put that in perspective, imagine a cube of rock, ash, and pumice, each side measuring over 2 miles. Now imagine that material being hurled into the sky with such force that much of it reaches the stratosphere. The ash cloud from such an eruption would blanket entire regions. Manila would disappear under feet of ash. Agriculture would cease across much of Luzon. The economic and human costs would be incalculable. Could it happen again? The answer is not if, but when. And the when could be tomorrow, or 10,000 years from now. Geological time operates on scales that make human planning almost meaningless, but there are clues. Written in the rocks. In the layers of ash that geologists extract from the lakebed. In the chemistry of ancient lava flows. In the shape of the caldera walls. Each layer tells a story. Here, a thick band of white pumice, a massive explosive eruption approximately 5,500 years ago. There, a thin layer of dark ash, a smaller event, perhaps similar to 1911. Below that, another thick layer, another catastrophic eruption, this one over 30,000 years old. The pattern repeats, layer after layer, going back hundreds of thousands of years. It is a rhythm. Not regular, not predictable, but undeniable. The Earth has a memory. And that memory is patient. Understanding this deep history changes how we think about volcanic risk. Most disaster planning operates on human timescales. We plan for events that might happen in our lifetimes. In our children's lifetimes. Perhaps our grandchildren's. But what about events that happen every 10,000 years? Or every 50,000 years? They seem so distant as to be irrelevant, and yet they are inevitable. And when they occur, they reshape civilizations. There's a branch of geology called tephrochronology, the study of volcanic ash layers to understand eruption history. It is detective work of the most patient kind. Scientists drill cores from lake beds and examine them centimeter by centimeter. They analyze the chemical composition of ash particles. They use radiocarbon dating to determine the age of organic material trapped between eruption layers. Slowly, a timeline emerges. At Taal, this timeline reveals a volcano that erupts frequently on human timescales, but catastrophically on geological ones. Small to moderate eruptions happen every few decades. Large eruptions every few centuries. Catastrophic eruptions every several millennia. This pattern is not unique to Taal. It is common to volcanic systems worldwide. Vesuvius, Krakatoa, Mount St. Helens. Each has its own rhythm, its own cycle of violence and rest. And each eventually produces an eruption that exceeds anything in recorded history. The challenge for modern society is this. How do we plan for events that are statistically certain but temporally unpredictable? How do we convince people to take seriously a threat that might not materialize for generations? How do we allocate resources to prepare for disasters that our children's children might never see? These are not just scientific questions, they are philosophical ones. They force us to think about our responsibility to the future, about what we owe to people who do not yet exist. In Japan, there are stone markers placed centuries ago, high on hillsides that say, "Do not build below this point." They mark the high water line from ancient tsunamis. They are warnings from the past to the future. And in 2011, when a massive tsunami struck, the villages that heeded those ancient warnings survived. Those that had forgotten or ignored them were destroyed. We need similar markers for volcanic hazards. Not just physical monuments, but cultural memory. Stories that persist across generations. Education that never ends. Planning that extends beyond election cycles and quarterly reports. In the vast expanse of geological time, some forces are so immense, they defy human comprehension. Yet we live alongside them, our lives entwined with their ancient rhythms. This is the story of one such giant. This is the story of Taal. Located in the Philippines, Taal isn't just a volcano. It's a complex, a world within a world. What you see isn't one simple cone, but a caldera, a massive crater created by a cataclysmic eruption long ago, now filled with the serene waters of Taal Lake. And rising from that lake is Volcano Island, which itself contains another crater lake. It's a lake within a volcano, within a lake within a volcano. A geological nesting doll, a testament to the Earth's intricate artistry. But for the people who call this place home, Taal is much more than a geological wonder. It's an ancestor, a deity, a provider, and a constant looming threat. For centuries, its fertile slopes have offered bountiful harvests, and its waters have teemed with life, nurturing communities. The name Taal itself is believed to originate from an old Tagalog word, possibly referring to a native tree or the very land itself, showing how deeply the volcano is woven into the cultural fabric of the region. Ancient legends speak of its power. Some tales personify the volcano, treating it as a temperamental god whose moods dictate the fortunes of the people. These stories, passed down through generations, served as more than just entertainment. They were a form of ancestral knowledge, a way to understand and respect the awesome power that slumbered beneath their feet. They encoded warnings about its behavior, teaching communities to read the subtle signs, the gentle tremors, the wisp of steam, the changing color of the lake. This was a shared cultural memory, a survival guide written in the language of myth. This deep, often spiritual connection has fostered a unique brand of resilience. Living in the shadow of Taal means accepting a certain level of uncertainty. It's a daily negotiation between human life and the raw power of nature. You see it in the eyes of the fishermen who cast their nets on the lake, in the farmers tending their crops on the volcanic soil, and in the tour guides who share their island story with the world. Their lives are a testament to adaptation. But what happens when the slumbering giant awakens? The 2020 eruption was a stark and terrifying reminder of Taal's true nature. After decades of relative calm, it unleashed a colossal plume of ash and steam that soared miles into the sky. The sky turned dark in the middle of the day. Lightning cracked through the ash cloud in an apocalyptic display. The fine gray ash fell like snow, blanketing towns and cities far and wide, choking the air and collapsing homes under its weight. The world watched as a mass evacuation unfolded. Tens of thousands of people were forced to flee their homes, leaving behind their livelihoods and everything they owned. The once vibrant tourist spots became ghost towns. The green, fertile island was transformed into a desolate, gray moonscape. The eruption was a profound trauma, a moment that shattered the fragile peace. Yet, in the aftermath, the story shifted from one of destruction to one of incredible human spirit. Communities rallied, neighbors helped neighbors. Strangers offered food, shelter, and support. It was a powerful display of Bayanihan, the Filipino spirit of communal unity and cooperation. This wasn't just about rebuilding homes. It was about rebuilding lives, about holding on to hope when it seemed all was lost. And slowly, life began to return. The government established a permanent danger zone, a necessary but difficult measure that displaced many families for good. But for those on the periphery, the work of recovery continues. Farmers are experimenting with new crops, adapting to the altered soil. The lake, once feared to be lost, is showing signs of recovery. Nature in its own time is healing. The story of Taal is a powerful microcosm of our planet's future. How do we coexist with natural forces that are becoming more unpredictable in a changing climate? How do we balance economic needs with ecological safety? Taal forces us to confront these questions head-on. It reminds us that we are not masters of the earth, but participants in its grand, often violent and always awe-inspiring story. Looking at Taal today, you can see the scars. But you can also see the signs of new life. Green shoots push through the gray ash. The waters of the lake shimmer under the sun. And the people forever connected to this place continue their dance with the giant. Their resilience is the most powerful force of all. The future of Taal and its people remains unwritten. Another eruption is not a question of if but when. But the knowledge gained from the past, combined with modern science and the unwavering spirit of the community, offers a new kind of hope. Taal is more than just rock and fire. It is a living monument to the cycles of destruction and creation. It is a symbol of nature's immense power and a testament to humanity's enduring ability to adapt, to remember, and to rebuild. Its story is a timeless epic, reminding us that even in the face of awesome power, life in all its fragility and strength finds a way. Thank you for joining us on this journey to the heart of the Taal volcano. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more documentaries that explore our incredible world. We live on a dynamic planet. Earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, droughts. The Earth is constantly changing, constantly moving, constantly reshaping itself. And we, as a species, have learned to adapt. To build where it seems safe and to rebuild when we discover it isn't. To study the patterns to make predictions to prepare as best we can. And then to accept with grace or resignation or faith that some things are beyond our control. Taal is not unique in this regard, but it is a particularly clear example. A particularly beautiful and terrible reminder of the bargain we make when we choose to live on this restless earth. As we end our journey through Taal's story, let us return to where we began. To that afternoon in January 1911. To the 13 minutes that changed everything. Those 1,335 people who died, they were not statistics. They were fathers and mothers, children and grandparents. They were fishermen who knew every current in the lake. Farmers who could read the weather and the color of the sky. Teachers and shopkeepers and boat builders. They had dreams. They had stories, they had names. And though most of those names are lost to us now, buried under layers of ash and time, they deserve to be remembered. Not as victims, but as people who lived fully in a dangerous place, who made their peace with uncertainty, who chose life even when life came with risk. Their legacy lives on in the communities that surround Taal today. In the children who practice evacuation drills. In the scientists who monitor the mountain. In the fishermen who read the lake's moods. In everyone who has learned to listen to what the earth is saying. And what is the earth saying? It speaks in the language of tremors and steam, in the rise and fall of magma beneath the surface, in the patient accumulation of pressure over decades and centuries. It is saying, I am here, I am active. I am part of the cycle of creation and destruction that has shaped this planet for billions of years. Respect me. Understand me. Prepare for me. But do not expect me to change for you. This is not a comfortable message. We prefer to think of nature as something we can manage, control, optimize. We build seawalls against the ocean and dams against rivers. We level mountains for roads and drain swamps for farmland. We act as if the earth is ours to shape. And then a volcano erupts, or an earthquake strikes, or a hurricane makes landfall. And we remember we are not in control. We are participants in a much larger system, one that operated long before we arrived, and will continue long after we're gone. But here is the paradox, the beautiful paradox. Accepting that we're not in control doesn't mean giving up. It means choosing to engage wisely, to learn, to adapt, to prepare. To build communities that are resilient rather than rigid. To create systems that can bend without breaking. To remember that survival is not about dominating nature, but about understanding it well enough to live alongside it. At Taal, this understanding grows stronger with each generation. The monitoring systems improve. The evacuation plans are refined. The cultural memory deepens. And when the mountain stirs, as it did in 2020, as it will again, the response is swift and informed. People evacuate, lives are saved, and after the eruption passes, they return. They rebuild, they replant, they resume their lives, not because they've forgotten the danger, but because they've remembered how to live with it. This is what Taal teaches us in the end. Not how to prevent disaster, we can't, but how to persist through it. How to honor the past without being paralyzed by it. How to prepare for the future without being consumed by fear of it. How to live fully in the present, knowing that the present is all we ever truly have. The mountain waits, as it has waited for hundreds of thousands of years. Beneath the lake, magma continues its slow accumulation. Gases dissolve into molten rock. Pressure builds. The cycle continues, and on the shores, life continues too. Rosa Mendoza sits on her porch, watching the sunset paint the water crimson. Maria Santos studies for her nursing exams, dreaming of the future. Father Antonio lights candles in the chapel, offering prayers for another peaceful day. Fishermen cast their nets in the golden light of dawn. Children play in the streets, their laughter echoing across the water. They live in the shadow of fire, but they live fully, courageously, beautifully. And in their living, they teach us something essential about what it means to be human on this restless earth. The story of Taal is not over. It will never be over, not as long as the planet lives. New chapters will be written in ash and stone. New eruptions will reshape the island. New generations will face the same ancient choices. But we, having walked through this history together, carry something forward. An understanding, a respect, a memory of the mountain that waits, of the people who lived in its shadow, of the delicate, dangerous, beautiful balance between humanity and the forces that shaped our world. Thank you for taking this journey with us. for listening to the story of Taal, the silent giant that speaks in thunder, that writes its history in ash, that reminds us again and again of our true place in the natural order. If this story has moved you, if it has deepened your understanding of our living planet, consider subscribing to Fury of the Earth. These stories matter, these memories matter, and together we keep them alive. The mountain waits. The lake shimmers in the morning light. And life, precious and temporary and utterly irreplaceable, goes on. Until the earth speaks again.